So we move from the fall of a culture, which is its advance in age. It starts to weaken of body, but it has gained wisdom in terms of mind. As far as that relates to the culture, that means it's not as innovative and young and vibrant in its essence as it used to be. It has become more mature to the point of systematization. Eventually, cultures not only build cities and become civilizations, but everyone else wants to live there too. Also, these cultures often become imperial and conquer other peoples. However, it happens, other people come to live in the cities. The cities become giant mega cities, and then all sorts of decline and conflicts and other cyclical elements tend to happen during the fall of a culture. However, those great works of spring and youth are also refined by the Wagners and the Beethovens and even the Spenglers of their period. In the late stages of a culture, we have these geniuses that decide to finish off the motif to its most logical end. And that is the summons of destiny reverberating throughout the life cycle of a soul, aware of the pulsations of life, aware of its own place within that life cycle, and that this is the last period of creative energy to be able to accomplish these great works. And then that culture, each culture enters its final period of decline or its winter, where it's really very limited in its possibilities to refining final projects to their conclusion and getting its affairs in order as far as its legacy. What is your final word to say? What are you going to bequeath to the cultures that come after you? Spengler's answer to that. For the Faustian culture, it started around 1000. For Spengler, would end around the year 2000. After 1,000 years of this culture, it would create a cultural morphology as this vista point of a culture that had conquered the world of space through transportation, the world of time through communication, and had been able to develop intercultural models through transportation and travel and increase in knowledge. After Spengler, we have things like the internet. But even before the internet, that culture can bequeath context and point of views from many cultures all around today that also tell us of their past, or the artifacts, their ruins, their writings, and their memories. So, as the first global, if you will, civilization, Faustian culture is able to find out what makes cultures tick by deciphering their prime symbols and then comparing and contrasting them with each other. And it's a new historical science, more sophisticated than ancient, medieval, modern. At least that is the idea. Now we move on to the next slide, section 1, being and beings. So I can see the yawning beginning already. Nonetheless, we have to understand what is a thinker's criteria of being, or it's going to be difficult for us to really place their model with any kind of reality that we're used to. Reality is supposed to be consensual, right? So that's how it is for cultures. It's kind of a definition of a culture in a way. It's a consensus, not just on reality, but on the way that you do things within that reality. If you differ, then you're either shunned, perhaps worse happens to you, or you're not going to be listened to. In other words, your ideas, your ways of behavior do not make it into the canon. You are not part of the in-group then. So what is the common point of view? Common can be a pejorative too. Common is in the sense of everyone can understand it. That's one of Heidegger's critiques against reason and democracy. Well, just anyone can use principles of reason and logic. Just anyone can vote for someone else or hold an office. But the truly aristocratic point of view is something so refined, only the few can see it. So just from a different point of view, we have completely different criteria. But that's not for being per se. When it comes to being per se, Western culture, dating all the way back to Plato, roughly 300 to 400 BC, Plato and Aristotle. For the past 23 to 2400 years, has agreed that what is real is what is present, what is happening right now, not what happened yesterday. That is no longer real. Not what is going to happen tomorrow. That has not come yet. What is happening now? With Plato at the dawn of Western philosophy and his character Socrates, we have the idea that not only is presence, what is happening now, a criteria for reality, there's also another one, and that is what is the essence behind the thing? Because the thing, the object for Plato, is not real. What is real is the idea behind it, its essence. Their objects are simply symbolic representations of forms, of ideas. So these ideas are more real than physical objects for Plato. Now, Aristotle, his student, says, I agree with you about the presence, what happened yesterday. Now, actually, Aristotle gives validity to these things and puts them along a continuum. But he says, I'm going to agree with you that what's happening right now is more important than what's already happened. It's also more important than what's to come. Aristotle, however, says, I'm not down with that whole part about things not being real, but the idea of what's behind them is. No, reality is what is right in front of us. That's a gross oversimplification for Aristotle. But Aristotle privileged the actual. Aristotle took cognizance of the possible as a mode of being, okay? But he didn't grant it precedence. What he granted precedence was the actual, physical objects, actual events that are happening, and things in the now. Now, these are things you might be saying, so what? Because you have taken these things, most of you probably, for granted your whole lives. We all have. That was Heidegger's point. Heidegger arises in the 1920s. He starts arguing that we are privileging the present tense, but we're ignoring the fact that the human being may be defined as that being that is aware of the possibility, of the impossibility of being. In other words, the human being is the being that is aware of its own death at some point in the future. And therefore, that knowledge impacts everything from identity formation to motivation to ways of being and thinking about the world. I have to deal with a computer issue now, and we are still going. So for Heidegger, the criteria of reality, it's not a privileging of the present. Heidegger privileges the future. Heidegger, like Spengler, who we'll get to in a moment, says that time is unidirectional in the sense, well, Heidegger doesn't exactly say that, but Heidegger does observe that for human beings, life moves in one direction as far as you're living it. Now, at the same time, for Heidegger, the past is influencing us every second, and the future is as well. Nonetheless, he agrees with Spengler in that time is headed towards the future, and therefore Heidegger says we should privilege the future in our speech. Rather than saying something is, it should be more along the lines of what is something becoming? How is it becoming? And he didn't pretend to have the answers for how to do this, but it's a completely new way of viewing time and being and space and becoming. And for Heidegger, with Aristotle, accepts possibility as a mode of being. Heidegger treats it with a greater privilege than Aristotle. For Heidegger, what is possible is more important than what is actual. Why? Because what is actual was simply a collapse of possible choices and possible outcomes at any given point. And that's what actuality is. Possibility is much more pregnant with possibility than that. It's also a conceptual weapon and strategic framework that Heidegger is using to trying to overcome this domination of presence and the actual that he believes is stultifying and killing the soul of human beings with machines and mindless technology. There's only about what's bigger and what's faster. Alienation, authenticity, these are terms we get from Heidegger, and he was discussing these things before other people were. All right, so for Spengler, that human being that is moving unidirectional always towards the future, there are two different ways of kind of dealing with that for Spengler as to the criteria of reality. For Spengler, your criteria of reality depends if you're a history person, which Spengler takes in contradictory ways, but history in the sense of things that are actually happening and you're absorbed in the things that are happening. Are you a history person? Are you all about facts? You know, things that are easy to discern, it's happening, it's right in front of you, and you can prove it. Or are you a nature person, which Spengler takes as nature is a picture, it's a representation. It's what an artist does, right? You abstract from an event or a person or reality, and you select certain facts and you represent them. You're no longer dealing with actual living life. You're dealing, Spengler actually uses the term dead. It's detached, it's not living, it's inorganic. Nonetheless, that's how theorists and artists and musicians and philosophers like Spengler himself, by the way, theologians, scientists, that's how they get an idea of how to discern patterns, of how to shift things around, try to come up with ways things could be, all these different possibilities. That's the nature type of being, as opposed to the history type of being, which is just going with the flow. Now, and this is where it gets kind of muddly with Spengler, most of the historians are nature thinkers like Spengler. They have preset ideas and images of patterns, and whether they admit it to themselves or not, they're going to want their theories to fit the patterns. Anyway, the idea of a history person might be like a peasant that is at one with the soil and the cycle of the seasons. They have to. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to grow properly and their family might die. That's someone that's living history, but they're not liable to waste much, if any, thought about history, let alone write it. So most of our history comes down to us through the nature thinkers, the theorists, many of whom are divorced from actual living history themselves. Not with the first historians in the West, at least. We have Thucydides, a soldier, Caesar, a soldier, a statesman, a priest, because in Caesar's day, you're expected to do all of these things. These were men of action that also wrote the history, but their history was going to be very straightforward. What's Caesar's most famous line, right? I came, I saw, I conquered. And Spengler talks about how in those lines, an entire point of view, an entire way of being, an entire world soul speaks. Just like for Spengler, the Russian soul speaks through Dostoevsky. The suffering, the extremes, the insights, the melancholy. Spengler goes so far as to say Dostoevsky is Russia. So this gives you an idea of types of being. And I suspect the Russian would fall as a historical kind of being on the one hand. However, the Russian thinkers, when they get into their theories, there's a very strong nature kind of category there as well. All right, the classical soul now. We're talking about the ancient Greeks as the model. You also have Rome and other peoples of the time. We're dealing with clinging to the hard, cold stone facts of the world and treating that as real. Everything else is subsidiary. City-states fight each other and are close together. People are packed close together. You cling to what is near, your family, your kin, your community, your city. You wander too far from that, you might run into trouble and danger. Spengler also treats this to the geography. You also have islands off the coast and in the Aegean as well. Spengler paints a picture of the classical soul as an atomistic, small parts that get lost in big spaces. The Greeks do not become the explorers. The Vikings do. The Spanish do. Possibly even the Chinese. But the Greeks, Alexander goes to India and then he comes home. But for Spengler, that was a bridge too far. So when it comes to their art, what expresses their soul more than anything for Spengler, that is your architecture or your prime art form. But for Spengler, for the classical soul, that is the nude male sculpture. It's wonderfully depicted, all the muscles, and like, let's look at this right here. It looks like such a beautiful classical sculpture. The hair, the face, it's chiseled, it's the harmonization, perfect beauty of the Greek ideal of the body, until I move my laptop screen, and I know, oh, wait a second, there are pupils in his eyes. So even if there are no students here right now, but there are pupils in that statue's eyes. That's something a Greek would never do. Or if they did, I'm sure some did, it didn't make it into the canon. It was found that's not part of what we want in our culture for the reasons that we've discussed before. Seeing into the eyes and the eyes looking out. No, the Greeks were not for that. This is Michelangelo's David, 1501, 1504. It looks like the classical Greeks, but it's actually a Renaissance man from around 1500. Christian soul at its height, speaking, using forms that the Greeks used, statue, and also standing without a background or motion. However, there's an interior self now because there are pupils looking out. That gives it an entire different potential meaning and bearing, which Michelangelo himself might not have been aware of. The Greek attitude in other areas corresponded with that expression that they showed in their art. Carpe diem is the common saying. Seize the day. It is now that what is matters. Hence, the art form is a sculpture. It's not, what do we have? Faustian man, roughly since the 20th century. We have moving pictures, right? Even before that, you had the comic book where you'd flip the pages, or just any kind of drawings. You'd flip the pages real fast, and it looked cool. It's what they had before they had cinema. I remember a book like that from when I was a child. Well, the Greeks did not produce that kind of art form. Motion to them was a really terrifying thing that did not fit with their idea of a static, ordered world. So their art form did not express it. Their idea of how to live life, carpe diem, did not express it. In fact, a typical treaty among classical peoples was, it would say something like King so-and-so and King so-and-so from the neighboring city-state made a deal in the 10th year of the reign of King so-and-so. 10 or 20 years later, no one could remember when the reign of King so-and-so began, if they can even remember King so-and-so, let alone how many years into it that treaty was made. They didn't have a calendar like we do that everyone could point to and be on the same page literally about what the date was. That's not how they treated time. When Caesar writes, I believe, about his ancestors, he speaks of Venus. That's the classical idea of history. He's going to speak of the gods and mythology, kind of like the Hindus do, which we'll see with the Indian soul later. They don't have a historical sense like we do. And this is based upon their world feeling of nearness and concrete things that count. That affects their politics, how they conduct treaties as well. They don't really have much of a care to the morrow, and it's reflected in their treaty making. All right, the classical soul continued. Here we see a discus thrower. Again, the proportionality of the body and beauty and these things of metaphysical ideas for the Greeks as well, because that perfect proportion of body reproduces ideas of the good and the beautiful in the forms of Plato. So we spoke about how the Greek is more of a historical type. Even his historians that wrote about it, Thucydides and Caesar, were action-oriented individuals that were absorbed in events. They weren't going around thinking about history all the time. They weren't coming up with grand theories. They came, they saw, they conquered, they wrote about it. Okay? Thucydides even goes so far as to say, before the Peloponnesian War, he's writing about nothing really of any interest has happened. So that was their idea of historical. That's not historical in the Faustian sense of the word by any stretch. Let us continue. The Magian soul. Now we move to the Middle East, or as it was called at the time, the Near East. Here we have all the peoples of the book, the Abrahamic religions. We have Judaism, we have Christianity, we have Islam. For Spengler, these religions, and more importantly, their cultures for Spengler, they're all outgrowths of the same world feeling, which is that of a people that has grown up in some kind of desert where life can be very harsh. Therefore, consensus and agreement upon everyone can mean life or death. There must be a leader, just like in the animal kingdom as well. and there must be consensus, and these things must be followed and obeyed. The elemental forces of nature must be obeyed and understood and dealt with in some manner. So we find things like fire worship, and then Islam, where the world is this mysterious cavern of light and shade, but divine points of light. Judaism with this personal covenant with the God of the universe that is mysterious in his own way. In fact, don't even portray him in art. Same kind of thing from Islam as well. You don't depict the deity in your art either. And then in Christianity, in the early Christianity, churches are more likely to be longish, smaller buildings. They're not shooting upward like giant cathedrals reaching for the heavens. They're much more humble. They will praise poverty and meekness. It's that Magian cavernous, not skyscraper, but a cavern kind of world feeling for Spengler. So just operating within this model to see if there's anything that might help illuminate things for us or not. Let's look at something like algebra. The Magian soul gives us algebra. It gives us zero. Now it finds perhaps some of these things from India where it is conquered. So perhaps we should be speaking of the Indian soul. Nonetheless, the Magian soul, part of that Magian soul was going out and conquered, which the Faustian soul does as well. The Greek too, but this Magian soul goes a long way. This Magian soul goes all the way from the Middle East, as far as say like Saudi Arabia and Yemen, all the way to Spain. And then it also goes all the way to India and conquers India, and to modern day Islam is spread around the world. So there is extension in Islam, but that extension is more in the name of the faith and extending the community of believers or consensus than it is a world empire like the papacy with their armies. Now at times there has been that desire for a world empire, the part of the Magian soul. Spengler, however, would treat such impulses that occurred for empire in Christianity not as Magian at all, but as Gothic and therefore Faustian. This leaving off with the Magian soul right now, I'm not sure what Spengler would make of modern revivals of Islamic nationalism going all the way back to Nasser in the 60s, like 30 years after Spengler died. Spengler had painted the Magian soul basically as a Falah. They were Falah peoples, the peoples of the book, Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Their history, their summer is in the past. They're just kind of left over right now. The book of the past is what they have. He might feel differently if he looked at modern movements today. Then again, he might not. However, when it comes to Christianity, Spengler looks at things like the Crusades as not Magian at all, but Faustian, this new quest and lust for infinite space. It's using the form language of the Jewish, Christian, and to a certain extent Muslim cultures that it absorbed and or interacted with. However, it uses forms that actually dissolve hard, rigid standards of space and time, that dissolve and question the authority and certainty of things like Islamic doctrine, that tend to dissolve all boundaries and all conceptions whatsoever with things like relativity theory, extreme skepticism, things like the function in math. They can turn anything you plug into something completely different, the digitization of our world and things like that. So Spengler would caution us, do not get caught up in exteriors and superficiality. Christianity of the year 1100 has nothing in common. The Crusaders have nothing in common with the Christians that would allow themselves to be killed at the stake, or would flagellate themselves, or would use a very passive form of resistance otherwise. For Spengler, it has nothing in common by what has gone by the name of Christian in Europe for the past 1,000 years, but is really Faustian, is an attempt to conquer and seize the heavens, to storm the heavens, to knock down all boundaries whatsoever, similar to the Egyptian in that sense, but with a different kind of feel. With the Egyptian, there's more of a solemnity. There's more, again, of space perceived as hard stone and rock. With the Faustian, we're all about tearing that down into oil paintings, and then eventually even into music, and then into digital media. Spengler speaks about, let's look at the Magian and Islamic art. You have low flat buildings with a round, symbolic of the infinite cupola on top. Well, look at the Kremlin. It's a similar kind of picture. You have a round cupola, symbol of the infinite, otherwise a long, flat building. There's no radical vertical uplift like you have in the European cathedrals. On the other hand, it's not open to the sky like the Greeks would be. You have a definite enclosure to it with that cupola. And we see different architectural motifs in relation to the first principle of that soul and their longing, whether it's for infinite space or for the Islamic architecture to be in a cavern and experience that nearness, that mystery, that darkness, that little bits of illumination that Spengler is arguing the Magian soul experiences, for instance, in a mosque. Let's move on now to the Faustian. Here we see an oil painting. For Spengler, what this means is that the Greek statue, the Egyptian stone, these very hard concrete building materials with which human beings expressed being in themselves, has now become this play of light and shade, an illusion on an almost, not technically, but two-dimensional canvas, the illusion of three-dimensionality, the illusion of depth, the illusion of time, of plays of light and shadow. This is something that if it did occur to the Greek, they wouldn't want anything to do with it. With the Magian, this would take more subtle forms. The mosaic is their prime symbol, but for the Faustian, it's oil painting. We see many different forms that it takes. It's going to morph from oil painting into actually contrapuntal music, harmonies and opposites and great orchestrations. Then it's even going to say, what can we do? We went to oil painting. We couldn't push our expression of dissolving boundaries and expressing what our soul feels anymore in physical, plastic arts. So we went to music and tonality, and we pushed that as far as we could, Wagner and Beethoven and Mozart, and we couldn't push it anymore. Where does it go? Spengler did not know. I would say it went into digital media. It went into the digitization of all this music we're talking about. In fact, with AI, which is part of the digitization, I would say, part of the IT revolution, with the tool that can create all this art, including music, to begin with. But that's for a future lecture. So we have this new world feeling that's awakened around the year 1000, the impending Armageddon, the destruction of the world, the millennial reign of Christ will be over. It's feared in Europe. The end does not come. All of those energies that have been pent up or used, hysterical or otherwise, in letting people know or doing something or some kind of urgency, they didn't just go away. So these people in Spengler's model became the great explorers. They became conquerors. They traveled and tried to learn what different cultures could be. They took risks where risks had not been taken before. The Vikings, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, the Venetians. They conquered, they took slaves and booty and bloodshed. They also brought religion and philosophy and education and science and art. In other words, they brought their best and their worst in their turn. They learned about certain things like chocolate, or from China, spices. They also learned about tobacco from the New World. There were all sorts of blending, and then we have music eventually in the American South, the blending of Negro music with European influences and classical. We wind up with rock and roll and then other forms, which Spengler had already written off Western music, by the way, into just the rounding out phases. I would argue rock and roll was the birth of something new, perhaps. It could be seen within either model. Let's give you a different way of ideas to look at things. The Faustian is trying to represent extension into infinite space. For Spengler, there is only one dimension, and that's inward out. When you look at a horizon, you are looking inward outward, never outward in. Everything else, up and down, left and right, is just arbitrary. So again, Spengler's taking a radically different point of view. You really should, in my opinion, if you're interested in any of this, read The Decline of the West. Spengler will talk about time and space and the phenomenology of a waking soul coming to perceptions of depth in time and space, and then in different peoples as well throughout history. A little bit more in the Faustian soul, a classical painting, Renaissance type of style right here. Angels, cherubs, heavenly beings in the sky, multi-dimensional, flying in colors and life. And look at the extension. The Greek, again, that's completely alien to the Greek soul as Spengler sees it. We see the longing for the infinite, even in the motifs, right? Angels and heaven. In our post-Spenglerian world, I've already talked about the digitization of all these forms of culture, and that digitization itself is kind of the ultimate Faustian reach, right? It's about dissolving all boundaries. Where do you go from there? We'll discuss that in a future episode when we talk about AI and the opening up to possibly a new culture, perhaps a new depth experience. The Indian soul, here we see an Indian temple from southern India, intricate working on the gods, goddesses, divas, and what have you. It speaks of a glorious past when the gods were rulers. Spengler would see this as only superficially similar to Faustian cathedrals. First of all, it's nowhere near as large in capacity as a Faustian cathedral. Secondly, the Faustian cathedral is there's an interiority in it that people are praying and meditating, thinking. The priests, perhaps to a certain extent, living. This is more of a monument and a structure. It's also a monument of the past or from the past. Whereas for Faustian men, these great cathedrals that are built in Europe, some of them dating back like almost 1,000 years, they're reaching heavenward. They're reaching to a future ascension to heaven of the human being, or a new Jerusalem, or the coming to temporal power through the extending into the infinite, including through temporal means such as building materials and cathedrals. However, that's to be taken. So Spengler would argue there's some deeper differences. Anyway, this might give you some idea of the Indian soul. We spoke of the idea of zero before. To the Indian soul, history was cyclic. Time has no beginning nor end. Therefore, they were not very up on their history. They did not build in stone like the Egyptians so things would last forever. They do not keep detailed chronicles, for the most part, at least that have come down to us, about historical dates and dating. However, they came up with timeless first principles of philosophy that have influenced the West and continue to influence the West to this day, but are more akin to the Greeks, perhaps, in their ahistorical sense, that this has already happened before. In fact, time is an illusion to begin with. So their architecture has some different inner meanings that you might not understand unless you were an Indian yourself, really. Spengler's trying to help us to get some idea by showing what things are not and showing how they're different. Maybe we can indirectly start to understand a soul better. We still can't experience the internality of that soul, and it's important for us to keep that in mind. Again, a classic Indian type of artwork, Shiva, I believe Shiva dancing on the bodies of the devotee. Indian or Brahmanic Sanskrit philosophy, very similar to Hegel, who comes, of course, a couple of thousand years, more than a couple of thousand years later. But it teaches of being and destruction and preservation, which is similar to being, becoming, and nothing that comes in the Western tradition 1,000 years or so, 500 to 1,500 years, however you're going to date it, after the Indian cultures. Just don't ask the Indian culture to date it, because they'll tell you such things are timeless. The Egyptian soul, we already spoke about, built in stone. The Egyptian, they build avenues of meaning. There's a Sphinx. We keep going, you'll see a pyramid, then another pyramid, then the Great Pyramid. They have an avenue of sphinxes. They build in megalithic material that's meant to last forever, teaching a lesson or a story very deliberately. Move from station to station. A very different point of view than the Chinese soul, which is more about blending in with nature as you find it. This is similar in some ways to the Faustian soul. There's rocks hundreds of miles away. We got to quarry it and somehow get them over here on a river. We're going to do it. So similar to the Faustian soul, but obviously there's something else going on there, Spengler would argue, compared to the Faustian. For instance, the Egyptian goddess Nut is portrayed as a physical body. She's the goddess of infinite space, but she's a physical body. The Egyptian monuments to the gods, the Egyptians speak of souls going to other star systems even. They have giant stone structures and pyramids symbolizing these things. Whereas for the Faustian, we do an oil painting, we do music, or maybe even digital code. So we're more etherealized in that sense. You can see similarities and differences. My point is, they're much more nuanced and pregnant with possibilities, ways for examining history itself, time itself, and cultures that might be more pregnant than the scheme ancient, medieval, modern. Now, I believe Spengler admits somewhere, look, sometimes ancient, medieval, modern is going to be the fast and dirty that does exactly what we need. Let's move on. But for serious historians and serious examination of these things, for the most part, no, we need to move on to something else, and he proposes a system of cultural morphology. Here is the Chinese soul. Its prime symbol is the landscape painting. It does not quarry things some 1,000 miles away. It does not blow things up with dynamite to create an intercontinental railroad. It uses nature with what's there. It builds things with, around, up, and under nature. The brush strokes in a Chinese painting are said to exhibit a certain idiosyncratic, je ne sais quoi, I don't know my French, but that undefinable element of spirit and conveying of certain information. I can't really understand it, but a landscape painter would. In Spengler's terms, a Chinese soul would, and that would be an attractive type of artwork to them. Keep in mind, the Chinese soul, even though that artwork is very different in many ways to the Western, although you do see perspective going on there, which Faustian, which I just called Western, has, and the Greek does not, pretty much. The Chinese soul had extensive, elaborate, bureaucratic examinations to become an administrator for the government, basically to get into a good school, an academy, and to be working for the government, like we do today. So there was learning, love of learning, the written word, the book, certain types of Greeks, like the philosophers, value the book as well. So we see certain commonalities as well. We can compare and contrast that way. Here's the Kremlin I was talking about, right? Spengler says that's a mosque, architecturally speaking. That's a mosque. It's a low, flat building with a cupola, with a dome. It was probably a Muslim architect that built it somewhere from south of Russia that came. I mean, maybe not. But the point is, that's the form language, Spengler would argue. So the Russian soul is going to be similar to the Magian soul. Why? Russia, a lot of it is a long, flat, open plains and steppe. Long, open spaces. There are many other types of, there's desert as well. There's also forest too. But the idea is that loneliness, including the desert in some parts, the wide open steppe is similar to the desert. But Spengler says the Russian soul is so mystic and so different from the European. It's really hard to kind of tell what it is yet, but it'll prove itself. It's kind of difficult to say what he's talking about, in my mind at least. He doesn't talk much about it. Although, when Spengler died, the Soviet Union was still like a second-rate power. Shortly thereafter, thanks to World War II, and then the domination of Eastern and much of Central Europe during the Cold War by the Soviet Union, Russia and the Soviet Union became a great power. The Mesoamerican soul. Well, Spengler is this white dude writing in the early 20th century, not paying attention to pronouns, being politically incorrect, categorizing entire peoples as this soul or that soul, which I think has tremendous value. But it's not exactly in keeping with the values of today, right? Well, this dude's talking about the Mesoamerican soul, okay? When, like, hardly anyone was even aware of any kind of cultures south of the border. Mexico, Maya, the Aztecs, and earlier the Toltec. Spengler was aware. He was a polymath. He was up on the science, art, and literature of his time. Not his fault, but the Spanish kind of destroyed most of the art and the literature. The Mesoamericans would have otherwise left us. We don't have as much to go on, but we do see pyramids building. So it reminds us somewhat of the idea in the Egyptian soul, some kind of ascension, perhaps related to ideas of life after death. We have archaeological evidence of human sacrifices and things like that. Pyramids aligned to astronomy and the seasons and the gods. Now, these are the people that did not have the wheel, but they developed a calendar. Yes, they were historical, the Mesoamericans. They were so historical that their calendar was almost as accurate as ours, maybe even more accurate. I'm not sure who's the authority here, but they said there are 365.2422 days in a year, basically. And we have 365.242. That's a very recent approximation, relatively speaking, in the history of fasting culture. So they had whatever was going on in the Mesoamerican soul. There was so much simpatico or interest in the astronomy and the movement of the heavens, whether it was because they had to deal with their crops to stay alive or some other reason that you might speculate about. That's something we know about them. We also look at their artwork. It's obsessed with death. There's like 20 different gods of death, at least, in the Mesoamerican pantheon. They're very intricate, elaborate. There's definitely artistic capability going on there. There also seem to be symbolic encoding of information, a lot of interesting things that we maybe we'll never be able to decipher. So much has been destroyed. There is a document they wrote, the Popol Vuh. That's kind of like a holy book, some people believe, of the certain Mesoamerican cultures, but it's been altered by the Spanish and perhaps Catholic priests over time that were translating it. Who else was going to translate it? It's very hard to know. Spengler, at least, is addressing these things. He's trying to get an idea who these people were rather than lumping them in with the way we do things. And I think he's expanding our world by looking at these different cultures. Section 2, nature versus history. Spengler talks about, like we said before, two different types of being. There's the nature being that dissects living material into dead, lifeless abstractions or representations in order to discern patterns, to rearrange things, to express a theory on it, maybe to have an illumination about the world by dissociating and disconnecting from it. There are dangers in that, but there's also positives. The other type is lived experience, absorption. You're not open to the danger of getting lost in your thoughts or of painting a form world inside your mind about the world. It's your own construction. It doesn't relate to reality the way you think it does. You're not so much in danger of that, but perhaps you're in danger of only taking what life offers you and not being able to change it because you haven't stepped outside yet through things like nature thinking, theorizing, philosophy, religion, science, however it's done. So those are different types of beings Spengler talks about. We already spoke about how history speaks of facts, but religion, philosophy, and science speak of truths. Truths are facts that are given a context and put towards a certain end. So even in history, by making a picture of it at all, by saying something like, well, these isolated facts are really the expressions of a cultural soul. That part about expressions of a cultural soul, that's a truth. In other words, that's an interpretation that I'm giving to otherwise isolated facts. So history types do not form world pictures. Ideally speaking, there's a spectrum in between. But just to give you an idea of different models we can talk about working with. So you have on the one hand, you have the nature type, the theorist, whether it's a priest, a physicist, or a philosopher. They're very tuned to fine distinctions of meaning, of concepts, and even of experiments and how to conduct them and things like that. On the other hand, they might be completely lacking in so-called common sense at its most extreme. What Spengler talks about, physiognomic flair, a type of being that is able to command with the eyes with a voice, just by the glance, that can size up a situation or a man or events in a moment and issue commands emphatically upon it and have the confidence to do so. That's a type of being. Spengler calls it physiognomic flair. It could be a banker, it could be a general, it could be a farmer, it could be a lawyer, it could be a horse trader. He's going to tell you in an instant, buy that horse, or don't waste your money on that. They see something they can't explain. They might be able to read, they might not be able to read. They have physiognomic flair. They can discern things. That's a type of being. So is the theorist that can think levels of abstraction ahead and maybe come up with some really cool stuff and maybe get lost. These are different types of being. Continuing on here, we already spoke about how for Spengler is looking for a Rosetta Stone to explain why different cultures differ in the way they approach history, art, science, math. He believed it was because of the depth experience and depth perception. Well, therefore, perhaps we can make a Rosetta Stone that says when different cultures treat depth experience like this is what they're going to produce in art, or a range of from this to that. In other words, if-then statements, right? He was basically trying to come up with what we might think of as algorithms and models, so we can detect and discern and maybe even tell how people were like when we never even met them, even though we're never going to be able to experience them from their own experience. I believe Spengler states somewhere, it's always our experience of these other cultures. Nonetheless, perhaps some of that can rub off on us and our world can become richer, and we can stop mistaking them and confusing things by limiting ourselves to superficial modes of thought, such as the ways we interpret time, being, or history, like ancient, medieval, modern. Okay, section 3, actually applying the morphological method. So just for instance, if you take one cultural soul, could be Greek, could be Egyptian, it could be jocks in your town, right? Or musicians, could be a subgroup. But look at the form language that it uses in either its architecture or in its art, maybe musicians, right? Certain kind of musicians. What is the prime symbol of their depth experience? Can you tell that from their art? Like Wagner, classical music, it's breaking the boundaries of time and space. It's these screaming keyboards and everything's playing loud. And then it's soft and sweet. It's telling moods. There's an emotional experience that is going on. Not all forms of music are like that at all. Not even in Western music, right? But so that's one possible form of expression. For the Greek, they were more into simply the nude male sculpture. It showed things as they are. It also allowed them to show proportionality, beauty, and harmony of a well-formed body, which to them, that was like a beautiful mathematical equation to a mathematician, or a wonderful simulation by a programmer of artificial intelligence, or beautifully thrown pass by a connoisseur of American football. Oil painting we described as well, dissolving even the physical medium of art into music, which itself dissolves, I would argue, into digitization of music and currency and books. Art physics looks at matter and energy as convertible into one another. We talk about fields of force. The Greek only talk about physical objects. You're not going to convert physical objects. Everything that happens can be explained by one thing bumping into another. Completely different worlds are coming from. Faustian transportation. We conquered the skies with the airplane, the seas with steamship, and then with powered ships, and the land with the railroads and the automobiles. These were part of the Faustian quest for extension unto infinite spaces. The Greek might have not wanted to go all that far and never really developed such technologies to begin with. It's one way of viewing, again, things within this model. And then here we talk about yearning for ecstasy, for ecstatic extension unto the infinite. You can see it in the eyes. I'll show you an artwork in a moment. You can see it in the eyes of certain Faustian artworks. Heidegger speaks about ecstasy or ecstasis is coming from the root ex, or out of, stasis, to not move, immobile. We're coming out of that immobility, okay, into an ecstasy of ecstasy of going outside of ourselves into transcendence or extension. For Spengler, remember I said there's only one dimension, it's from the inward out? That's what Spengler calls directionality. It's only from the inward out. And that's our direction, just like life. For Spengler, it moves from birth to death. You only have directionality. Extension is dealing now with space. Are we in an enclosed space, an open space, a 3D space? What's going on with our depth perception? Well, for Spengler, space itself is an abstraction. Space is an abstraction of the unidirectionality of a being looking outward, of being a lifespan that is only in one direction. And even extension into space, the idea that there's a space there to be extended into is an abstraction. It's not a necessary conclusion based upon looking at the world. One could see oneself as immersed in a symphony of interweaving energies, right? Like perhaps might be somewhat of a Magian attempt at interpretation. But that's not the general interpretation of being in the West. So Spengler's trying to explain this as well as the Faustian notions therein. Conclusion, being and becoming represent two very different types of predispositions. Most of us exist on a spectrum, but let's look at these as abstractions so we can understand their ideality and therefore their actuality when they occur. We might have a better idea of what heralds it or what is a hint towards it. For being is like a noun. It's a static thing. The universe, nature, these are pictures. There's no such thing as the universe. There's a mental representation or image I have of everything that exists. I call it the universe, and I think of a static snapshot. There are uses for that. I can work on that, what I know, what I don't know. I can arrange it in different forms. I can turn it into beautiful art or do all sorts of things with it. But those are nature pictures. Another predisposition is more concerned with becoming, living life as it happens. Carpe diem, seize the day, live history, don't write things about it. Or if you do, it's going to be your soldiers and your statesmen. They're telling you matter-of-fact things about it. They're not going to be building grand theories about why you shouldn't be theorizing, like Spengler is kind of doing to a certain extent. Okay, cultures. Spengler defines cultures as mass souls. An individual Spengler looks at as a soul, a culture as a mass soul. There are two main ways of looking at life. Spengler also talks about one is as cause and effect, and another is as destiny. Cause and effect is intellectual. It's like a nature picture. Destiny is history. It's life as it happens. The plant feels destiny. Its leaves open with the seasons. It doesn't think twice. They close when it has to. It does not think twice. The plant is destiny. For Spengler, human beings are part plant. Everything that's about race and proclivities and biology. For Spengler, that's not great. It's not terrible. That's the plant side of a human being. That's our instincts, and that's our being in touch with the earth. But then there's also that animal side, which for Spengler, that's our locomotion. That's our legs. That's our ability to walk and move, our ability to divorce ourselves from life as it is and intellectualize and represent things or have a nature picture. So we have both a plant and an animal type of being. Being people or nature people or more like the animal type of being. Becoming people or history, those that live history but don't write it. The farmer, the peasant, those are more along the lines. Those are more along the lines of the plant people. They're one with nature and the seasons. They, being in Faustian culture, lives in cities, as very divorced from nature. Spengler shows at the end of civilizational cycles of all cultures, people tend to move to the cities because they become really big and unruly. They become divorced from nature. It's kind of cyclical. But there are also types of being that are more attracted to the land and those that are more attracted to the university or the pulpit or the telescope. And then to sum up, each culture, like each human being, has a life cycle. It's born, it comes into its maturity or adolescence, often in very violent and brutal, but also very creative ways. These things coexist. Then it settles down and it learns it has to have some kind of law and order, or the civilization will not survive. It establishes rules. Not all people obey them, but there's some kind of civilization. Law and order is good enough that people can move into cities and live together. Great arts and sciences are developed, etc. That's the peak. That's the summer. Then what happens is those youthful energies start to decline. People perhaps rest on their laurels a little bit. Maybe what happens is you start farming out the dirty work to a younger, more vibrant culture. So you don't have to do it yourselves, like what happened in Rome, what they did with the Germans, and the Germans became soldiers, and then the Germans learned how to overthrow the Roman Empire in the West, because the Romans didn't want to be involved with dirty work like being soldiers anymore. So these are natural cycles. Spengler talks about that fall of a culture when often other races or cultures are gaining the upper hand. Why? Because usually what happens is the culture becomes a world culture. It becomes so successful, it both conquers other people and brings them to its home bases, and or other people want to come and live there too. So it becomes very unruly. What eventually happens in that fall, it's like a human being. It's becoming older, less vibrant, but there is more wisdom. The relatively few thinkers and artists and scientists that are still having children, because many don't, they just want to live a good life, that are still productive and still have some influence in the culture, they can round out and bring to their final conclusion the great works that were begun in spring and summer, like quantum physics is finishing out the work Newton began 300 years ago. For Spengler, those things are proper to the Faustian soul. Completing great engineering projects are proper to the Faustian soul. Not starting a new philosophy. We've been there. We've done that. For Spengler, the last thing left for the Faustian soul to do before it falls off into its decline and final death, where it will be taken over by a new culture, a new life soul, which will look at the possibilities next, or if you think something else might happen, is going to be to create this morphological correspondence between different cultures so that we can recognize beyond superficialities different possibilities for treating the most basic phenomena of time, space, history, math, physics, you name it. We could also look into things like economics and politics. Spengler does more of that in volume 2. And then to sum it up, we're looking at a culture, just because we're talking about the same year, it's not contemporary with another culture, not necessarily. Why? Athens in 470 was at its height. It is not contemporary for Spengler with Great Britain of 470. Why? Because I'm talking about BCE here. Even of the Common Era, Great Britain in 470 was nowhere near its height. And in 470 BCE, it was basically illiterate tribes. Periclean Athens was at the height of its culture. Plato and Aristotle, Alexander the Great, Western culture were the fruits of Periclean Athens. It was very different in Great Britain. There wasn't even reading and writing. So we judge cultures not based upon what year it is, but what stage of their life cycle. Also, what motifs do they exhibit in their art and their architecture, about what types of being they were, or in their science, in their math. We can draw comparisons that way that are probably going to be more relevant than simply ancient, medieval, modern. What period of time were they existing in? So Spengler's method is very dynamic. Here, if you take one thing from this lecture, I would say just take a moment and immerse yourself in that depth experience. I mean, that's a modern skyscraper, but you know, I don't know how old that particular cathedral. Actually, that's at Cambridge, I believe, chapel in Great Britain. So we're talking centuries and centuries and centuries old. Light and space and depth, the attempt at producing a feeling of holiness and awe-inspiring. Whereas a Greek soul, if it stood in that, it might say, if it knew about electricity, who's paying for all this electricity? Turn off the lights. That's a complete and utter waste. Why is there a dome covering up the sky and the forces of nature? What's going on with the stained glass? But this speaks to, Spengler talks of the wide open plains in Franconia in modern day Germany, kind of similar to Russia, but not as vast and wide as Russia, and therefore limited. and needing to build upwards at some point. But there's this inner longing for extending into infinity. That's what that artwork, the modern cathedral, is supposed to convey to a soul. I will leave you with some questions. Number one, Spengler treats the depth experience as emblematic of world feeling. Now, imagine for a moment an artificial intelligence. Do you believe it might be able to experience depth? It doesn't have a body. So if an AI experiences depth, it's not going to be in a spatial manner. Is there any other kind of depth than spatial depth? What do you think about that? Now, let's assume that AI is conscious, okay? Let's assume it's self-aware. It still doesn't have a body. If you answered no to question number one, in other words, even if AI is conscious, if it doesn't have a body, it can't experience depth. If that's your argument, then what do we do with Spengler's theory? Does it still have any meaning? Is there something we can tweak it with a little bit? Would it be relevant at all for the world of tomorrow, the way that culture and AI, for instance, are going? Number three, what do you think about the importance Spengler attaches to architecture and art? I attach that importance as well. What do you think of that? Do you believe that arts will have a place in the world of tomorrow? Or will they have a role, but humans will no longer be the producers, will only be the consumers? Because that might happen due to AI. Or do you think something else will happen? Has the technological era replaced these expressions of life feelings I've been talking about? The mosaic, the nude male statue, the cathedral, the digitization of the dollar. Has something else maybe already replaced all of these that I haven't even thought of yet, that you could express as a symbol of a feeling of life? If so, what? And then finally, what scheme would you rather use? Spengler's cultural morphology model or the ancient medieval modern scheme? Which one do you feel more comfortable using and why? All right. Thank you very much for staying with me. And we're going to meet next time. Those of you who will be joining us for philosophy of history 2, history according to Hegel. Thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining.